Now, according to many sources, empathy is the #1 quality every writer is supposed to have, especially in UX writing. But there's a big problem with that, a problem that pretty much no one talks about. So today we do. Hi, my name is Kat and I teach people about writing in tech, and on this channel you will find everything that you need to know about writing, telling a great story and making the world a better place with words. So if you care about all of that just as much as I do, make sure you hit subscribe and ring the bell. Now, empathy is easily the most frequently mentioned quality that a creative professional is supposed to bring. It is mentioned in job ads, in blog posts, in newsletter articles. It is mentioned in social media discussions. Wherever you look, that is where you will find empathy named as the #1 quality a designer or a writer should bring, especially in the field of UX. And I mean, that sounds about right, because after all, especially as a creative or as someone who's building products, you should be able to put yourself into your users' shoes in order to create an intuitive and seamless and human experience for them, right? Well, as with many things in this beautiful life, it's not that simple. So let's dive into this. Now, supposedly empathy is the #1 quality that allows us to see the world through our users' eyes and understand their needs, and hence design experiences and build content and write copy that just works for our users. At least that is how it's postulated. And to me, seeing something so consistently, almost aggressively shoved into our faces, that's almost always a reason to check whether a certain concept or idea can actually hold ground, or whether it is just something that somebody once said and then it has gotten reproduced over and over again so often that it became a popular truth, if you know what I mean. And to really get behind the concept and the value of this concept for us creators, we need to dive a little deeper and first of all, look at what empathy actually is. And the Oxford Learner's Dictionary defines empathy as the ability to understand another person's feelings, experience, etc. That is one definition for empathy. And we have another definition coming from the Cambridge Dictionary, which defines empathy as the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences by imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation. And I think both these definitions kind of align quite naturally with how we would use the word empathy in our everyday lives, casually. Now, when we read about empathy as an important quality for creative professionals like writers or designers, we often hear that this is what it takes to create great experiences, apart from being actually good at your craft. But there are some studies that question that truth. For example, there is the so-called self-as-user bias, which basically says that we as writers or designers naturally, intuitively assume that users will approach and solve problems in the same way as we ourselves do. And that is something that we do entirely unconsciously in the form of saying, hey, this is the only logical step to follow, or of course, the label should say this and that. So something that seems like a truth or even a consequence of logical thinking, but it's not the truth. And it's not logical thinking. It is our own biased opinion. And there is also another bias called similarity bias, which basically says that we generally empathize more easily with users who are more similar to ourselves in regards of, for example, demographics or education or experiences. And that's a huge problem, because these two biases alone mean that if we rely on our empathy, we may create non-inclusive experiences. Because the big question here is, can we really have the same empathy, the same amount of empathy for all users, even for those that are very different from us? Like, can you as an able-bodied neurotypical person really empathize with a dyslexic user or an autistic user or a hearing impaired user? Are we really able, as the definition goes, to share these users' feelings and experiences simply by imagining what it would be like to be in their situation? I'm not too sure. Now, let me tell you about a personal learning that I had in this regard just recently, because the other week I read this amazing book called Considerate Content by Rebecca Berry, and I will put the link to that book in the description box below because it is amazing. And this book is about how to create inclusive content for users of all abilities, skills, and needs. So basically, it's about creating inclusive and accessible content. And the book really is so good because it also includes first-hand interviews with users who actually have ADHD, dyslexia, autism, and so on. And there's also an entire section about users dealing with mental health issues. And I really recommend this book to everyone working in content or communication or UX, but especially this interview section because it is really insightful for creating experiences if you don't live with one of these conditions. I, for example, learned that black text on a white background can be tough to read for some users because for some of them, the contrast is simply too strong and therefore overstimulating. And for some, the text might then become a little glary and actually be harder to read. I personally wasn't aware of that, and I don't think I would have been able to consider this just by relying on my empathy or my imagination alone, because I would probably say that black text on white background enhances legibility. And that was kind of a personal aha moment for me, to see that empathy is not really a reliable guiding principle, simply because it is just really, really subjective. It's basically making assumptions based on our own experiences. And that means that I might be able to empathize better with women of my age, for example, or German women or other writers, and less with neurosurgeons above the age of 60 or basketball players below the age of 15, or whatever group comes to mind that is just very different from my own lifestyle and demographics. But the biggest problem with using empathy as a guiding principle is probably that is just not a structured or systematic or even proven approach. It's basically following your intuition, your gut feeling, right? And as such, it can even overshadow other sources of information, even more professional and objective sources of information, because we feel it so deeply and so strongly, and we're so convinced that that is the right thing. It just feels like the truth, a universal truth. It's just like, hey, black text on white background gives the best legibility. That's only logical. We don't even question these things because they seem so logical to us. And that is what makes it so problematic and so destructive. However, that doesn't mean that empathy is an entirely unnecessary concept. We just need to understand and utilize it more constructively. And here's how I think we could do that. Now, as we've seen, saying, oh, I am an empathetic person, so I am a great writer or a great designer, or explaining our decisions like, I know I would appreciate such and such an error message. That is just not how empathy makes us great at our work. That's just how we add bias and actually exclude people who have different needs and experiences or demographics than us. Simple as that. However, there are indeed ways that empathy can serve as a guiding principle and as such enrich the experiences that we create. And to understand these ways, we first have to understand the concept of empathy a little better. Because I told you kind of a popular definition of empathy, but psychology looks at empathy as a more complex concept. For psychology, empathy can be of two kinds. Number one, affective empathy. That's what we most often mean when we use the term empathy in our everyday life language. This form of empathy involves emotional reactions, feelings, and identifying with someone. So that is something very emotional, affective, as we said. It's kind of an emotional reaction to what we see happening to another person, and it happens in an instant. And that is actually, as I said, what we would define probably as empathy if we don't think about it too much. And then we have number two, the cognitive component. That is more about understanding someone factually, like taking on someone else's perspective by gaining more detailed information about how they might experience a certain situation. So that is the intellectual part of knowing and understanding someone's perspective and experience. So the latter is the more analytical part of what we call empathy. And that's actually what we should focus on when we want to involve empathy in our work. Because working with this part of empathy, the analytical part, does a couple of things, but first and foremost, it sparks our curiosity, so to say. Because if you rely on affective empathy, what happens is your emotions are simply there. They are a reaction. Your assumptions are there. While the cognitive kind of empathy would be like, I'm not too sure. I wonder what that is like for you. I wonder how you see this. So we start craving more information, basically. Like, hey, I want to understand you. Tell me more about what it's like for you. So it encourages us to gather more objective data and conduct user research even, or desk research, but we definitely want to get into that. That is how the intellectual and analytical part of empathy works. Now, based on this new and extended understanding of empathy, we can now draw some conclusions on how to make good use of our empathy. And conclusion number one is exactly that. Number one is follow your cognitive empathy, not your affective empathy. But there's more, because we can't stop at empathy. Empathy is only the starting point, basically, but there needs to be more. So conclusion number two is follow the research interest that results from your cognitive empathy. Your cognitive empathy should let all these questions come up in your head, like how do people experience this? What helps them in this and that situations? How do they see it? How do they like it? And based on this research interest, conduct structured professional research that answers those questions and explore more questions that come up along the way. Conclusion number three is make sure you follow a mixed method approach to combine quantitative and qualitative research to really get a nuanced and comprehensive and balanced image of your users or your target audience. And for the love of God, talk to real people. You hear me. You go out and you talk to real people. Don't try to create personas or user profiles with ChatGPT or Claude or any other AI tool, okay? This is not representative, and most probably it's heavily biased as well. Not most probably. Very, very certainly. And also conduct inclusive user research. So when you run interviews or any other form of user research or testing, make sure you choose participants that actually represent all parts of your target audience, including all ethnicities, age groups, social statuses, abilities, and so on. And I know that in the real world, companies often don't want to invest the time and the money to do all that. I know that, but still it is the right thing to do, and therefore the right thing for me to recommend. And I'm actually a little tired of accommodating to the decision makers that think that real research is too expensive. And I'm also tired of offering them lukewarm solutions when what they should actually do is invest time and money in the research. And that is why today in this video right here, I refuse to offer a compromise of a solution that is like, okay, if you don't want to invest the time and the money to do research, then you can do this and that. No, please do research. Do your research. Do your research. Invest in research. Take some time and some money and conduct the research. And to complete this, conclusion number 4, the last one, work with frameworks. No matter if it's personas or empathy maps or a job to be done framework, make sure you involve structured approaches, because as I said, the biggest issue with empathy is that it is not a systematic, reliable, professional approach. And by involving methods and frameworks, we have kind of a counterweight to guide our empathy professionally. And when we guide our empathy professionally, especially our cognitive empathy, it can have great benefit for us. So all in all, it must just be very clear that we need to question our own assumptions, and that using empathy, even if it is disguised as just logical thinking or drawing conclusions, can never actually replace research and talking to real people to actually really truthfully understand them and their situation. Now, as always, I would love to hear more about your thoughts and experiences on the topic, so make sure you share them in the comments, and I will also make sure to read them and reply to them. Also, make sure to check out writewithdrkat.com for more writing education. Make sure you sign up to my newsletter, the UX Writing Memo, so that you don't miss out on a thing. Link is also in the description box below. And other than that, as always, there is nothing left to say for me except keep on writing, enjoy the process, and I hope to see you sometime soon.